Welcome to SmithWeekly Discussions, an occasional program for our members of SmithWeekly Research. Please note this program is a private discussion and everything contained herein is for entertainment and educational purposes only. With that, we hope you're in a comfortable position, along with your favorite beverage, to enjoy the discussion. We remind our audience to examine our show notes attached to each of our shows to better understand how our program functions. Before we get into our discussion, we want to say thanks for questions coming from the audience at SmithWeekly, including Paul M., Fabi L., Brent S., and Cindy W. We have a new guest on the podcast today. Mr. Trevor Hall has joined the program. Trevor is the host of Mining Stock Daily and president of Clear Creek Digital, a group that is focused on the junior natural resource sector that provides various services and investor awareness and education through its platform. The group is based in Colorado, and you can learn more about Trevor and his work via their website, miningstockdaily.com. Trevor, welcome to the podcast. Great to have you on.
Hey, Andrew, good. Thanks for having me on. Looking forward to being on the other end of the mic here.
Yeah, absolutely. It's always good to do these things and always a pleasure to have other folks that do what we do with this podcast in their own unique way come on and give feedback and talk about the market and talk about these companies and the management teams and CEOs and IR people and all these types of things. So, yeah, always good to catch up again. And it's been a while since you and I have chatted in the same room. So, Trevor, why don't we kick it off here with you telling us about yourself? Give the audience a flavor of your experience, your background, and what you do.
Yeah, so I guess the background is actually academically in journalism. I have a master's degree in journalism from University of Nebraska. And then following that, I was mostly involved in documentary filmmaking in my early career and did things with National Geographic and Discovery Channel. And then kind of kind of fell out of love with that industry and was kind of lost in the mud there, trying to figure out what I was going to do next, and I actually ended up taking a position at the Colorado School of Mines as a marketing and communications person there. But that's where I found mining and exploration, and for can't even tell you how or what, but I was just so enthralled with the sector and learning things about the industry. I mean, from scratch. Like I knew nothing. I was so green. I knew nothing about mining other than they blew up rocks and used big trucks to haul it. That's about all I knew. But I just found it really interesting what the industry was doing and what its intricate position in supply chains and the global world and the economies of the world. And so I just wanted to learn more. And so I ended up when I was at the school, ended up taking a class. It was like Intro to Mine Engineering. So I took it for a semester to learn more, but I was trying to figure out, all right, what is my journalism and content background? How does it fit into this? And so that's when I started launching kind of my own endeavor where I was doing some advisory work on just content and social media for a couple of years with a number of different companies. One company out of Botswana, another company based here in Colorado, but has an asset in Australia. And at the same time, it was when when podcasting started to really make a move, and you're hearing a lot more people like putting out podcasts and using smart speaker technologies on like Amazon Alexa and the like. And so I said, well, I've got this journalism background. I did radio, all through university, mostly spinning, independent rock music, which was a ton of fun. So I had familiarity, and obviously I've been interviewing people for a very long time. So like, well, why not? Let's put together a news program every morning, talking about the news out of the mining sector and exploration sector. And so in July of, I think it was 2018, my friend and confidant Dave Kranzler and I launched the Mining Stock Daily morning briefing. And so I woke up about 5 a.m., watched the news come in, and then recorded a quick morning briefing of that morning's news before the market opened. And so we started doing that, publishing it on Amazon Alexa, and then eventually put it in on the podcast networks, and learned how to do that just by trial and error. And then, so that was the only piece of content we were putting out, was those morning briefings of news. But then it just kind of evolved into, we could take this so much further. Like, we could do corporate updates, we could do market analysis with other people. And so we went from one morning briefing a day to, one morning briefing and then a long form episode on the Friday. And then that evolved into morning briefing, then multiple corporate updates, market analysis during the days, Monday through Thursday, plus the long form episode on Friday. And so we publish anywhere between, I would say, 8 to 15 episodes of Mining Stock Daily a week. And so we're very active because there's a lot of news to follow and there's a lot of people doing good work. And because of that, the business has also grown. And, I think we produce a trustworthy platform of content, despite it being, I guess you could say, advertising revenue business model. Like, we are known to have the ability to constructively ask difficult questions to anyone, including our clients and the people that we distribute information from. But we also expect constructive answers from those people as well. So I do think it's a trustworthy platform. We do not take that for granted, not one bit. And we're going to continue to strive and grow and continue to provide this very unique information from a very niche market. So I guess that's the long answer, Andrew.
First of all, it's a lot of work, and what you're doing there, the quantity, and also to keep the quality up is just, boy, that's a lot of effort for sure. And I appreciate you sharing the background and how you guys are approaching this particular platform as part of your work. And it's also interesting too that for us, one of the things we realized early on was it's difficult. The level of due diligence that we prefer to do really takes a significant amount of time and effort. And
Right.
we realized early on with our podcast, and I think you can appreciate this a little bit, is, you know, had we only had guests as a result of our due diligence in whatever sector, whether it's uranium or gold or what have you, that we would have ran out of guests pretty quick had we stayed with that idea. And so then, of
Yeah.
course, then we just said, we can have a program that introduces, talks, has a discussion, identifies patterns, identifies personalities, identifies how they answer as part of a low level due diligence. And
Yeah.
obviously, way more work is required. We try to get that across to, of course, our audience. But we realize that, really to keep the podcast program really going is we need to be able to have an open door, let the audience decide and sift through a little bit. And obviously, for us, there's more due diligence that happens in the background. And then, of course, we may or may not act on certain things through our investment research. Good to highlight that part too. And you also said something else in your comments back, was that it's okay to pick on these CEOs. It's okay to ask some tough questions. Some of the good ones are going to cover those tough questions in a way that's going to potentially satisfy some of the audience. That's another thing that we see is there's a lot of softies. And look, by all means, can take the criticism. We have definitely been soft with certain guests on certain issues. Also have the ability to ask questions if I see that it's worth the time and effort. So that's some of the discretionary things that we see. I always encourage people to ask tough questions. And I think you as a host and myself as a host have been respected in that regard, to the extent that it's sufficient that we need to put forth that level of effort, of course. Any comments just on some of the things I said there?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, and probably this goes back to you as well. I think one of the strengths of being able to ask those constructive questions is the fact that we don't live where that market lives. Like, I live in Colorado. Most of that market is in Vancouver. So I'm not like infiltrated into, that House Street scene. And so there is a little bit more, I guess, naivete coming into these conversations, which I think is a benefit actually for the listener because, like I said, I have a journalism background. I don't have a geology or a mining engineering background. I mean, I know enough to be a little bit dangerous, but that's come from, 8 years of working in this industry and learning more and more each day. But being away from that central hub, I believe, is a strength in regards to asking those questions and being able to, not shy away from them. Because I mean, I'm just as curious as the next person listening in. There's a lot more I don't know than that I do, and I just think that's more of a, that's a positive sign, specifically when you're interviewing people, than when it's not. And I also say, like, listen, like, I've been interviewing people for, oh man, more than 20 years now. So the mining stuff is and the exploration stuff has only been the last 10 years. But I mean, in the previous life, I was running back streets of Philadelphia looking for gang members to interview. I've interviewed cocaine manufacturers in Colombia for another show. I've interviewed late night TV show hosts in New York and Long Island. So, like, I've run the gamut with people as far as who you present yourself to, gaining that trust to ask them questions and know where that conversation is expected to go, and make sure that they trust me enough to provide, good answers, not to just pull the chain. Mining CEOs are as much criticism as they get from people like you and I. Man, they're a walk in the park compared to some other people that I've interviewed in my career.
Just with your past experience with groups like Discovery, National Geographic, how do you look at those platforms today as to how they've evolved and where they've gone versus when you and I probably are watching the VHS version of National Geographic programs?
Yeah.
How do you think those
Oh.
businesses have evolved?
Uh, yeah, that's an excellent question. I gotta admit, I mean, I don't watch them much anymore. I don't watch much TV in general. But when I was getting out of television, those channels, which were predominantly like docuseries, that is exactly when the reality TV model started really picking up steam. So you saw like the Big Brother and I don't know, like the Amazing Race, that type of stuff that was like getting a lot of attention, that reality TV. Then all of a sudden, other networks wanted to replicate that same production model. And unfortunately, it seemed like that reality TV type of model was overtaking the in-depth docu series or one-off special documentary shows that things like Discovery, National Geographic were predominantly known for when they started doing their TV networks. So the models changed exceptionally, right? Like, and I know a lot of producers in that area that when I was working in Chicago in TV, we were doing these docu series, and all those producers have now turned into basically reality TV producers as well. So I mean, the models changed dramatically.
Yeah, definitely is quite a bit different, and some of the motivations behind some of these as well. And you can continue to see these groups basically as a NGO essentially come out and start to impact different areas of even the natural resource sector, as we've seen. There's been misleading and false information come out of some of these groups. Perfect example recently is this program put together by W5 on the Cobre de Panama
Mm,
issues, just how they paint such a compelling yet false picture, whether it's the type of music that's played when a camera pans over a pristine rainforest, and how the translation voices come across as aggressive when in fact the people that were being translated aren't aggressive. The framing of the interview with Tristan as well. For an experienced person that has some level of knowledge in the sector, you just have to laugh, and it's complete hogwash. It's interesting. It speaks to the experience of the audience and the investor too. When you see these different things and you get information from kind of both sides and you see these presentations, how shiny the slide decks are, you can see through some of that. But yet at the same time, you also have to understand that some of those things are needed. They have to be part of putting forth out to the market a compelling story, whether or not it's a joke or if it's real. You still need to be able to deliver that. And so
right.
let me ask you this, just kind of moving on here a little bit. From your seat, given the things that you do, Trevor, how do you now look at the junior natural resource sector? From your position, of course, you
Mm.
are also an investor. but you're also participating and doing various things through your platform. But how do you approach it now when you look at these, this sector in general? How do you typically approach it? Give us your perspective from an investor standpoint.
Yeah, let me backtrack real quick here, just to go back to kind of, you mentioned the series on Cobra Panama. Never forget, like, Marshall McLuhan, the media philosopher, the best line that, like, if there's one line I ever took away from an undergraduate in broadcasting, was the medium is the message. Like, I will always remember that line. So, I can kind of take that away. So if somebody like that W5 is participating in the medium and the industry is not, you understand who's got the leverage there. So that's where I'll just leave that.
Yes,
My my
good point.
my my approach to junior mining. It's been a really hard couple of years. It's been so hard. It's just been really challenging. Like, I mean, I think I've seen a couple bear markets before in my short time in this, but man, this has been just a train wreck. But I guess the silver lining is, despite the very risk off mentality, despite the venture exchange in Canada, that composite just looking like it was going to fall through my computer screen and splash all over my desk. Um, Companies and management teams were doing good work. I think the market, as hard as the market was to participate in, and for the amount of bags I am now holding because of my probably over frothy optimism in many of the companies that I enjoy and people I support, and therefore I'm down. I think the market was doing a great job of picking out the winners, the going to be winners, and the going to be losers. I think there were overly, I mean, they were punishing companies that they knew didn't have good projects, were wasting capital, um, and just, the, like, the worst of the risk, I think, is what what the market was siphoning out. However, the market was also in a few ways supporting good companies, good management teams with the ability to hold a decent amount of cash in the bank or raise money when they had to. The market was also rewarding discoveries, which was good. And so you could see good porphyry discoveries getting rewarded as well, copper, gold, silver discoveries. The market was buying it up in a few instances. So, and I think, again, as hard as this market was to participate in the last couple of years, it was doing what it was supposed to do. It was weeding out the good from the ugly. And so, if this market is about to pick up, and I do believe that specifically in the gold market, precious metals exploration, that we are on the right track here, I do think that you kind of have a baseline of who those first movers are going to be, and we're starting to see it already in a few one-off cases. Like as gold ran up the last week. I mean, did every little explorer get the boat lifted? Absolutely not, but some did, and you could start seeing where you know the where those where that appreciation lives now. It's not hard to find. And so, yeah, I mean, I think the market was doing what it's supposed to do. As hard as it was to participate in, it's doing us all a favor. If you really want to start speculating in some of these risky exploration plays, all you got to go do is some simple due diligence. Go look at the chart. Who's got this first move up in the last couple weeks? What's their management team? What's their project? What's their ability to raise cash? I think it's pretty simple. I think the market did the hard work for us.
Good point. Yeah, the market has done some hard work for us as well, because I think if you spend enough time in the sector like you and I have, you have to be able to, I don't like to use this one, but it's the one that comes to mind, hold your nose and buy. That has been certainly something that we've learned. You have to learn the hard way on that. At least that's how we learned. And I think that's probably in this case, the junior markets, they're really the only way to learn well is
Yeah.
to get that pain. And you can't do it by simulation. Yes, you could take the approach of I'm going to spend a couple of years and I'm just going to read and research and do nothing other than that in the sector. That's a great approach if you have the patience to pull that off. But otherwise, probably like yourself, probably like me, we've had to come to the altar, I suppose, and get some serious punishment
Yeah.
before we understood, how to handle things. And so it's been a tough slog. It has been a tough slog. Even with that thinking that sentiment's beat up and these equities should be trading at a much higher valuation, I'm going to buy some. Well, that position accumulating has been happening for a couple of years now, short of maybe a couple specialty sectors, which we'll dive into here in a moment. But I fully agree. It's been a tough market. A lot of people have been hurt. Some people have been successful. Obviously, there's been some good success by certain teams, as you highlighted. We've seen that as well. And it is quite a process, and it's a lot of experience and learning to be able to convey to people. And that's, I think, the most difficult part of that, short of making a whole podcast series just on that education component.
Hmm.
Um, we'll move on here a little bit more and get your comments, but at this point, given what you've seen and given we both cover different areas of this junior natural resource market, different segments, let's just couple this in, of course, with how you approach these different segments, because as you know, there's different cycles for base metals,
Yeah.
precious metals, some of the specialty areas. What's interesting about this market is, in general, there's always some segment that's in a bull or bear moment. Any particular areas of the junior market segments that you are interested in right now, Trevor? Anything that stands out to you? And maybe we'll dive into company names in a minute, but maybe just general areas that you have caught your attention recently.
And I've stated this publicly over the last couple of weeks. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of really good gold plays, gold exploration plays out there. And in fact, and what's wild is that they're still not getting love. And so I think that, I don't. Nobody's chasing these things by any means. Nobody's pushing them up. But obviously, the precious metals explorers are a great opportunity right now, given where we're at with gold. But silver specifically, I'm just like I have started to accumulate more silver exploration equities because I've just never it's been wild. A couple of things like the gold silver ratio, like some people, throw that data point out the window, then you don't really care about it. But it is interesting to come back to. Very few times do we see gold make a new all-time high or have the 100 and $150 run it's had and see that gold to silver ratio expand. That's wild. So silver could play a little bit of catch up here with its relation to gold. I'm watching that 25, $26 level on silver like a hawk. If that level, if there's a meaningful move above that level, I think $30 silver is definitely in the cards. And all of a sudden, you're going to start seeing those silver bulls as like, we all love the silver bulls. We love them, but they can be annoying as hell. But they're going to come back out of the woodworks and push this silver squeeze narrative once again. And it might be real, but it all is going to come back to the strength of the dollar. Is the Dixie going to fall? It's showing weakness, but we've been here before, Andrew. Like every time we think the dollar is about ready to plummet, it shoots right back up again. So a lot of it is going to be predicated on the move in the dollar if precious metals, and specifically silver, can get that run up to $30 plus. So I'm watching it really closely. I'm taking some positions in silver equities because they are just so beaten up. Nobody wants them. Nobody's talking about them. There's some cheap valuations out there. I think so that's where I see an opportunity. I'm also getting interested just from a very contrarian perspective. We've done a lot of reporting on the nickel market, and it's just a mess because of high pressure acid leach in Indonesia, and them. The narrative is they're pushing a lot of inventory into the markets, pushing the nickel price down. The nickel equities, specifically the juniors, are just getting absolutely punished because of it. But there was a note out of Macquarie last week from one of their top analysts in China saying maybe that speculation about inventories is overdone. So there's a little bit of I don't know, maybe speculative light at the tunnel that perhaps it's maybe it is overdone. But if you're a contrarian, you want to look for things that are unloved, nobody wants them, they're cheap. Why would I think nickel fits that narrative perfectly right now? And so I have been looking at nickel plays as well. Now that's I'm not saying things are going to turn around this quarter or this year, but if you got patience, like yeah, you might be happy that you picked up some of those plays. A lot of nickel explorers and developers are doing really great work here in the United States and Canada. So I look there. Lithium looks pretty interesting again. There's talk about having another run up in the lithium price. I don't know if we get back up to that massive price per ton we were at 2 years ago, but obviously it runs in cycles, so I'm watching that as well. But in general, and I guess we could talk about copper. I've been pretty bearish copper because I was watching rates and I'm watching the copper graph or excuse me the chart, and it seemed like it was going to go one way or the other. I'm just not clear where copper goes. Inventories are being completely crushed, and so I can see the bullish case. But the bearish case is if we hit a global recession, which usually happens when nobody's looking, then copper and all the base metals are going to have a moment of reckoning, and that was going to be my buy. Um, so now I'm just kind of conflicted. Like, are we really in this soft landing scenario here? I don't necessarily buy it because anything could happen. I'm not necessarily buying a soft landing, but I could see everybody thinks growth and productivity is back and the Fed's going to lower interest rates and there's a lack of inventory in copper. So it's a no brainer. I just, things are never that simple. And so I guess I'm just conflicted on copper. Like I want to be very bullish. I mean, long term, I'm very bullish, but in the next, you know, 2 or 3 quarters, it's just hard for me to jump both feet in the copper market. In the uranium space, you know more about uranium than I do. Obviously, 2023 was a great year for uranium. I don't think we've hit the frothiness in the uranium market that we've seen in cycles past. Obviously, the spot price is doing really well, but the uranium equities, I mean, uh, you have a lot of the same people out there who've been calling this uranium market for a number of years and been diehard uranium bulls even when it was at $16 a pound. And they were right. I mean, it's there, but what you're not seeing is a massive crowd of generalists that will just jump from one trend to the other. At least I'm not seeing it from my end. And so I do think the uranium market, specifically the uranium equities, could see another incredible run, um, here in due time when those generalist type people start chasing it. So that's the whole commodities market in Trevor Hall's nutshell.
That's great. Thanks, Trevor. I'll spare the audience my comments on uranium. We've already made those abundantly clear recently, and there's a little bit of stuff out there that people can get that's publicly available on that. But no need to beat that one to death. And I guess the only thing I'll say is just with respect to that market, with the amount of hours and time and data compilations we've done on that sector since 16, just to put out that first report we did in 17, it took me a whole year to just get that thing compiled, and then we expanded it notably by 2019. But just before that, the work that started essentially in early 16, we were dumb enough back then in late 15 to have a couple of uranium stocks
Mm,
just as part of our research work. And most people don't admit this, but at that time, we were very green. We had uranium positions, very small amounts of those positions before we even started doing really heavy lift work. Generally, that was a mistake. I mean, we actually made some money because of a discovery, even during that crappy period of time. But initially, we walked into this, immediately got our feet wet, didn't have a lot of capital exposed at that time. But
Hmm.
then it was just that long period of all the research to come into it here. At this point, given the level of information that we have on the sector and the experience already in the sector, we're quite comfortable. I really don't care if the uranium price goes from 107 spot down to even the high 70s. Don't care because we understand it so well. It just doesn't concern us. And it's the spot market. It has some things that are important to it, some components that are important to it, but it's not everything about what's really happening in the sector. Of course, we can talk volumes and everything else. But anyway, I'll stop there because I don't want to beat that to death. But let me come back to a couple of things you said. There's a couple interesting areas that you mentioned. This has been beat up for a while. Do you have any take on the platinum market?
I don't. It's a great question because I just have not. I haven't dove into it. I know it's really beat up, but I mean, isn't it kind of linchpin to the electric vehicle versus combustion engine type manufacturing expectations over the next decade? I mean, it seems like that's really what's driving that spot price. I mean, I'm just asking you because
Yeah,
I if we're not going to produce as many catalytic converters and we're all going to EVs, I could see maybe some speculation on the bearish side there. But at the same time, we've also seen the data where the EV consumption is stalling, if not declining. I think I just bought a new vehicle back in December, and we have a plug-in hybrid in one vehicle, but I didn't want another one. I wanted a pickup, and so I went to the internal combustion engine thing. So I
sure.
yeah, I don't have
I
this, and I know there's a few plays out there that you could speculate in, and if the PGMs are really beat up, I mean, you could certainly start deploying money into that if you have conviction there. But I do think a lot of it right now just speculative on the EV market.
It's an interesting one as well. And this one, it takes some work to kind of understand the players in the platinum market a little bit. But
Right.
I'll make just a couple comments on this because I think it's interesting and it's something that audience should look at and audience should spend some time doing homework on besides what we say here. But, generally you have a palladium price that for a period of time now has been much higher than the platinum price. Now, from a density standpoint, platinum is the better of the metals. However, there's a manufacturing process and a retooling sequence to be able to swap between the two. And
Hmm.
generally, in my light understanding of this, and for a period of time, palladium prices were much lower than platinum prices. And this, we're talking over the span of decades here. And then it flipped and went the other way. So that's one component of, yes, the industrial use of platinum and palladium, and what is the trade-off economics of the price spread between the two, and also the effort to be able to retool and swap between the two in the manufacturing process. Now, as you say, ICE, internal combustion engine, that is a role to play in the application of platinum and palladium versus the push, if you will, into electric vehicles. Now, to some degree, you and I both know that electric vehicles as they stand today are much more material intensive
Yeah.
compared to an ICE vehicle, a conventional ICE. And so, first of all, I'm with the Toyota chairman. The idea that, look, the footprint, the inputs for these vehicles, the turnover, the life cycle of these vehicles, you know, ICE is still very important. And while it's hard to speculate what happens in 100 years from now, for me, ICE is a daily part of my life. From a standpoint of total costs, I look at a diesel internal combustion engine is very important to me on a total cost basis as I look at the life of a vehicle and use of that vehicle and the footprint. And there are studies now that are starting to show that electric vehicles, because of their footprint, because of their turnover, because of their life cycle, and all the parts, maintenance components, the batteries, and all the parts and pieces that go into this, the total footprint of those is questionable compared to internal combustion engine. For me, obviously, I'm over on the internal combustion engine side of things. I get that some of these applications for electric vehicles can make sense and work. But let's be honest, when it comes to rural applications, mountains, certain equipment applications, heavy duty use.
Sure.
Obviously, there's a lot of work to be done yet. But back to the point, the other piece is you have to look at the S&D, if you will, of the platinum market. And we knew for quite a while now, and I believe the price is still at a price point where suppliers, producers, if you will, are having a very difficult time. And as a result of the price point, you've had this period of basically, hey, we got to close this thing up. We're not making any money.
Right.
Obviously there's Russia influence supply as well here. It's a very unique and interesting market, but it takes time to develop out that next cycle. A lot of that bear cycle has been digested, and it's just a matter of spending some more time to understand, hey, what suppliers are losing their ass right now in the market? How does the industrial demand outlook look for everything? And then also, how does palladium and its price factor into the equation of the changeover that I mentioned before? We have to spend some more time on it. Obviously, there's
Yeah, yeah.
only so much time in the day, Trevor, right? So you and I are spending time with uranium, we're spending time with copper and gold, silver, and some other places. So it's hard to keep track of it. But there are select opportunities within that, and it could be management team based, it could be asset based, it could be a combination of both. I think the audience has a pretty good flavor of some different areas that they should be paying attention to here as well. On the specific side, if you don't mind, one of the questions that came in was, what companies do you think are total no-brainers in the current market conditions? I mean, anything, be silver, uranium, whatever you think there, if you want to mention any names.
Yeah, so I mean, I can obviously provide a few names. I was asked this question on a panel at PDAC as well, and I'll just say, some of these names are not only clients of mine, but also I'm a shareholder. So preface that I try to be as transparent as possible. The one that jumps out to me right now is Visa Silver. I shared the thesis behind the spot price of silver a little while ago. I mean, this is a market that's still just above $1 US on the NYSE. They're spinning out a royalty at Panuco. It's, the largest silver predominant resource, undeveloped silver predominant resource right now in the market. We just saw financials at a Silvercrest, which could be like, a future peer of theirs. Silvercrest just absolutely crushed it in their year-end and quarterlies. But Visa Silver with that royalty spin out, I think, is an incredibly great opportunity to get more value. I don't know exactly when that deal closes. I think it's coming up here in a couple weeks or less than a month. So that's one I would be paying close attention to. There is quite a bit of, I mean, and I don't know, Andrew. I mean, speaking of the uranium stuff, like, have you been following the news out of Sweden at all about them lifting their moratorium on uranium mining? That sounds like it's moving in a positive direction for the miners, and District Metals has a couple massive uranium and vanadium and critical metals projects up in Sweden now. I think Garrett Ainsworth is just, he saw the writing on the wall. He's managing that company really well, got those projects on the super cheap, and the market is looking for that moratorium to be lifted. I think if that's lifted, District is going to do really, really well. Garrett was one of the, those early explorers involved in the discovery of the Arrow deposit with NextGen. So obviously he's no stranger to the uranium sector. As far as like gold, I mean, there's just so many cheap plays out there in the gold sector right now. I don't know. I could maybe leave it at that. I do like Caliber Mining. They bought the Valentine project from Marathon a few months ago. We're starting to see a number of exploration results come in. That mine's going to come online here for Caliber, so that obviously gives them exposure in Nicaragua, Nevada, and then also Canada. It's former new market people. They know how to not only build projects, but build companies with a number of great assets and then eventually sell the company for big bucks. And so, I've been a shareholder of them for a little over a year now and just really happy with how that's they're making another company. They're growing another company. So I like that as well. Kennerland Minerals, Zach Flood, Young Geo, his team, they know how to generate cash flow, save that cash, and then also generate projects. Just some great explorers focused in Canada. They just spun out their interest out of the Frotet project with partner Sumitomo. They took that risk off the table and turned it into a 4% royalty on Frotet. That's a great gold development play. I think Sumitomo will probably publish a new resource on that eventually here within a year or two. So keeping close eye on that. But I mean, just great generators of projects and with a keen eye on the rock. And so I like that as well. On the lithium side, like obviously we've seen Patriot Battery Metals, that's kind of been like, the tier one exploration development story in the lithium space for a couple of years now. Because of what they put out, I think it was it CV13, that resource. I could be wrong there, so apologize if I'm not thinking that, if that deposit name is wrong. But that resource, we saw what market expectation is for what a tier one lithium deposit looks like. I do think Francis McDonald with Lift Power up outside of Yellowknife, they don't have a resource on it yet, but it's not difficult to do some, back of the napkin math on that and start thinking in 3D. And I do think they're going to, when a resource does come up, like, things are looking pretty similar to what that Corvette project originally put out. So I'm really looking forward to that as well. That's not a no brainer, but I do like that project quite a bit.
Appreciate some of the comments. I don't know some of those, Trevor, but I have heard of District Metals, and we've heard of the Sweden story over the years. There's another company out of Australia that has some deposits in that region, and we've heard about it for years. That's first and foremost. And second, this jurisdiction is not on the map as a uranium producing jurisdiction. So
Right.
there is, besides a lifting of a ban, which is great, and by all means, people should consider those things for their individual jurisdictions. But just because a ban is lifted, just would have to caution folks that doesn't mean uranium's being pulled out of the ground. That's obviously a big disconnect sometimes when people look at some of the deposits that are known up there. They're very big. I can also refer people to Australia, where there's some substantial deposits that people probably have forgotten about. Let's just remind
Mhm.
everybody those are in the ground. They're not being extracted. So there's a lot left to do. Doesn't mean you can't have discovery success and you can do well in some of the juniors. But I have seen people start to lean towards, well, these super deposits and they'll come online in 18 months and that'll be the end of the market. And
Yeah.
yeah, that all sounds great on paper. The reality is bringing it out and putting pounds in a drum and getting that off to the conversion facility is certainly a different story, but doesn't mean you can't have success. And if a political win is part of that success, by all means, that sounds really good, and maybe there's a proposition to be had there. The other one you mentioned is one that we're familiar with as well, Caliber Mining. A number of years ago, there was suggestions that they look at reduction of risk, specifically country risk in Nicaragua,
Oh,
which
they did that.
yes, they did, and so that was something that was ongoing, and this was discussed many years ago before there was even a first move on the M&A front. And I think investors have rewarded that. I think there was a lot of folks
Yeah.
in the investment community there that saw that, hey, you have to reduce a little bit of this country risk. Not that they aren't doing excellent with the administration in Nicaragua, and it's a tough administration. I know firsthand. These are tough people, and so for them to be able to operate the way that they have, taking obviously those assets from B2 Gold, which, Clive Johnson and the club over there have done a nice job with
Yeah.
their relationship establishment in Nicaragua, but also just the challenges, whether it's U.S. sanctions, the challenges with getting material out and selling it obviously in U.S. dollars, be it a Canadian company. There's obviously some of those things that you can get picked on for. Operations there are a substantial source of tax revenue for the government there as well. There's all kinds of funny stuff happening there. And you saw, as part of counter sanction punishment, you also saw that they have continued to support the free flow movement and even assistance to moving people up to the southern border of the U.S. And it's always funny, some of the things that you see out there in the political landscape that people tend to miss, or at least the mainstream misses. And then sorry, when talking about southern border for a moment, I have to just joke. There was the event there in Canada where there was that car that rammed into one of the facilities there at border control. The joke goes is, why would someone try to break through into the U.S. from Canada when the southern border is wide open?
Right.
So
Right.
you got to have a little bit of fun with this stuff, right? And
Right.
so, it's interesting to push back into Nevada. You've seen some of the political risk with places even like Panama, where you've had companies who have pipeline assets in Panama that have then switched gears and said, you know what, we better start looking at a place like Nevada. And, we actually just had a conversation with I-80 Gold recently about the
Mm-hmm.
Nevada proposition and the fact that we're seeing companies come back and diversify, jump into Nevada, which has been a very strong jurisdiction. And people are doing those moves, and I think investors are starting to appreciate that. So, and then of course, you saw the other pickup of the Canadian assets for Caliber as well. So they've got U.S., Canadian exposure, Central America exposure. As you know, there's deals to be had even in Central and South America still that are quite compelling, and some of these juniors, including
Yeah.
ones that have permitting out of their way, are still terribly valued. And then you have good things like, Lundin Gold, obviously a safer proposition, but Lundin
Hmm.
Gold has just knocked it out of the park thanks to the team there in the leadership with their work in Ecuador. So lots of stories we could probably exchange on that. But yeah, I appreciate your comments on everything there. And of course, some of the uranium juniors that are popping up and some of the strategies, some of the valuations disconnect. We're seeing Australian valuations generally elevated. I could make a case to say there's probably a company in the US that could exchange market caps, and it would
Hmm.
be more correctly aligned, at least how we see it from a data standpoint. So lots of different opportunities. And of course, you and I both know that there's finite capital, and we have to be careful about our allocations and what makes the most sense, of course. Um,
Right.
we can continue here with any comments you have, but probably have a good amount of audience here that are listening in that are new to the junior sector that maybe haven't gotten their feet wet yet, or
Hmm.
maybe they're just on the sidelines listening and learning first. Maybe they've also suffered through taking those educational losses that every participant has experienced at some point in their investment journey in the natural resource sector. But, from your perspective, any thoughts, maybe words of experience for them to take away?
Don't overcomplicate things. It's a very technical sector. You can dive into the weeds as deep as you want to go. That's as far as how companies were formed, the makeup of the companies, the cap structure. You can even go as deep as trying to understand the geology of the rocks, as much as you'd like. And hell, get yourself a bachelor's degree in geology while you're at it if you'd like. But the general game plan for these equities have always been the same: good management, good projects, know your jurisdictional risk. If you can manage those things, you have already deciphered, the good from the bad. Has the management team been successful before? Who's on the team? Do they have the capability of raising cash quickly and easily? Do they have a good following? That's number one. The rocks. Is it an overcomplicated story? Can that management team of those geologists easily describe to you what's happening with the geology? Does it make sense? Can you think in 3D? Can you picture this deposit in your mind? What's known and what's unknown? And can you picture what the unknown is, where they're going to be putting those drill bits down the road to expand that deposit? Does that make sense? And jurisdictional risk. We just talked about Nicaragua. In fact, I bought Caliber on that dip out of that geopolitical Biden news a couple of years ago with Nicaragua because I just thought it was overdone. So it was the best trade, one of the best buys I've ever had in this sector. But are you in a jurisdiction that maybe is riskier than you'd like, and are you okay taking on that risk? You know, the United States and Nevada is not without its risk. Don't get me wrong, but it is known to be one of the safest jurisdictions. Canada, same story. Not in one of the safest jurisdictions in the world, given whatever province or territory you're working in, but not without its risk. So make sure you understand your jurisdictional risk. One of the things, like specifically, like, and that's more subjective. That jurisdictional risk, sometimes is a little bit more subjective. I'm a shareholder of Collective Mining. They work in Colombia, in one of the most mining friendly areas in Colombia. But the market reaction to Colombia right now is not positive. They do not trust Colombia. I, it's one of those things like, I'm not wrong, the market is. That's kind of what I think about this. Like, I'm able to take on that risk because I actually think that market risk of Colombia right now is too overdone. There will be another change of political leadership in Colombia before it's all said and done with. In Guayabalas, they just continue to drill and drill and drill and find more porphyry clusters, good grades, a lot of precious metals in there. It's a great, great project, but subjectively, I think the market risk on Colombia is a little bit overdone. So take that for what you will. But those three things, like nail down those three things. You're not going to win all the time. I think the last couple of years has proven that. You're not going to bat 100 by any means. But out of that portfolio, if you have a couple winners, it's going to make up for a couple stalemates or losers. But those three things are the most important.
Well said. Appreciate that, and definitely agreed with a lot of the things you said there about how to approach it. And of course, again, it's a subject of how many hours of the day do you want to allocate to this. And you and I probably spend way too many hours than we should, just because we live and breathe this every day, and even have our families yelling at us as well. The perception of risk, as you said, is completely subjective. Understanding the cycles here as well, understanding that you have to get that story out, whether it's a good or bad story, you have to get that out to the market. That's very important.
Yes.
And I think there's lots of good things to take away there as well. Trevor, let me ask you this one, and this is a different, little bit of a different subject, but it does impact us here in this sector.
Yeah.
Is there any position from you on these trendy topics that impact the junior natural resource sector, such as growing influence of NGOs around the world impacting the sector, the push on ESG, which is a term that I have no love for, given basic sense with respect to corporate social responsibility and best business management practices, which obviously should remain, in my opinion, discretionary, and every business has the choice to seek success or failure based on their policies and their practices. They don't have to be mandated. And then things like climate change and the war on carbon. I know that's a lot of stuff there, but maybe some points from you.
So, Andrew, there was a time in my life where I was, and I don't know, you can still say it still is me. I mean, I was very much an environmentalist, and I still consider myself an environmentalist. I mean, I love to spend time outside. I want to make sure the air is clean, the water's fresh and clean, and people are living as happy lives as they can. I like it when it snows a lot so I can go skiing, and I also like it when the bike paths are a little bit of tackiness on it. So I do think it's something to keep in mind. I do think it has been very much politicized, and I think we're finding itself into a cycle, whether you want to call it extreme climate change, ESG, or just kind of wrap it all into a bucket. But that pendulum has swung very much to one side. I don't know if it's got more to go or if we found it kind of coming back, but I do think there's going to come a time where it gets centralized a little bit, and I just think that's more or less like a cycle of an issue, like kind of like a fourth turning type of situation in there where we've moved so far to one side, people are starting to get really frustrated with that narrative and we'll pull it back into more central. And then who's to say, maybe in our lifetime, maybe after our lifetime, it goes too far the other way. And we get a little like Upton Sinclair type of moment that we saw earlier in the 20th century. So I think of these things. I do think this stuff is important. Do I think that we maybe spend too much time focusing on those aspects and forget about the real purpose of corporations and businesses? Absolutely. We've got to find a better balance here instead of, and I think some companies there are like, the great anecdotal examples of stories of companies trying to do that. Is it full industry wide? Absolutely not. We'd rather yell at each other than we would to actually listen to one another. Shit, Chris Cuomo and Tucker Carlson just sat down for an hour and a half long interview together. Those two hated each other. So, I mean, if those two can do it, can't some mining companies sit down and talk to some NGOs about figuring out a way to do it? I know, like Integra Resources up in Idaho, They know exactly who that opposition is going to be up in Idaho, and they are doing a really good job of trying to communicate with them before it comes into like diehard permitting process. So those things are happening, but in the grand scheme of things, I do find these things much more cyclical in the grand scheme than I do like, pointing finger. Like I try not to point fingers at each other. Everybody's to blame. Everybody's to blame. Maybe it's just me getting older and thinking more critically, but I do think the pendulum has swung too far to one side and will probably get pulled central.
Good comments. What's funny, I'm sure you could attest to this too, is some of these companies will be all soft with ESG and talk about their ESG programs on the front stage, but behind the stage, after the show's over, cuss the crap out of ESG and everything
Yeah,
it
yeah.
stands
No,
for.
I
And
listen, I get it. Like, and I have been critical of it as well, but I'm not saying it's not important.
sure,
I understand the general importance of it. Like, I don't know whether it's environmental, obviously we all want a clean environment. Like I would appreciate if we provided the most opportunity to people as we can. I'm not saying outcomes, but opportunity. So can
yes,
we provide the best opportunity to as many people as we can from all different walks of life? I think that makes a better. The governance thing, I think governments are way too strong-handed anymore. We've lost control of what actually, at least here in the West, of what this republic is supposed to look like. We don't need to go into that. That's probably another hour conversation. Like, and I've struggled. Like, I'm a child of the 80s. Like, I have struggled through these societal changes. I was young during the AIDS pandemic. I didn't quite understand what was happening during 9/11 and understanding that bitterness between, the West and people of Middle East. So I've seen this diversity, this blatant racism in many different aspects. I've tried to just understand it a little bit better so I can be a better person. I just like, and I was having this conversation with a good buddy of mine at the gym, and he's like, we were talking about things, and he's like, you know what, Trevor, know what the world really needs? And I was like, oh God, he's going to crack a joke or something. But he was absolutely serious. He said, we just need more happy people. I was like, God damn it. I cannot disagree with that. So I guess that's where my heart lives on that sleeve. Like the world needs more happy people. But on the business side and watching markets, like I do understand or think we're in this kind of like cyclicality of it all. So it's like, romantic versus tangible type of thing.
right. You definitely cannot mandate competency. You can't mandate motivation. You can't mandate outcomes, like you said. And there's so many different walks of life. There's so many different cultures, so many different
Yeah.
incentives and motivations for people to do something or do nothing. And I think that that is part of free choice and freedom in this world. And obviously, everybody has a different perspective. And you're right when it comes to these issues. Generally, it's to some degree everybody has some degree of fault. And the leaders, I don't appreciate hypocrisy. Some of the leaders out there, some of the governments, some of these people that are in positions of power, we want everybody to generally try to be happy as much as they can. Some places around the world don't facilitate that happiness. And then also there's just societal issues that don't facilitate that happiness, Trevor. And of course, you and I have seen that in our own country. And that
Mhm.
also generally the platforms that are being brought about by governments don't necessarily facilitate that either. And then there's this always underlying need in some personalities, not everybody for sure, for that continuing growth of power. And that's another thing that really complicates things, as you know. And these meddling in affairs that you and I, as younger
Yeah.
kids, believed were pure play, right thing to do, but in fact they've been meddled with. And the meddling comes from a position of power and money. And of course, we see that push and pull as well with some of these bigger narratives that we see out there, some of these needs to erode sovereignty of independent nations and independent thought and freedom. I do indeed hope that the pendulum, as you'd say, comes back to an area that is reasonable because we're human beings at the end of the day. We're
Right.
pretty basic creatures. We really haven't changed at all. Of course, some people would prefer that we become robots, but we we still cross the street. We still go to the bathroom. We still like to have good times. We still like to have a drink. We'd like to be able to pursue our own happiness, Trevor. And I think that is
Yeah.
also is a very important platform. And when that gets destroyed socially, I think that is where all these other things come in. And, to be honest, when we first came into this sector, I would have never thought we would be having discussions about the level of NGO influence on communities and misleading affairs and these other things that have kind of played into it. And then even see incompetency start to show up and really manifest itself in some of these industries where we're not sure that the next garbage man that comes out to pick up our trash is truly competent. And that's another thing we're seeing with some of these different areas and some of these different challenges where technical skills are on decline. At least in our experience, that's how we see it. But it's always good to talk about some of those things. But as you know, you and I could probably spend the rest of the day on a podcast talking about these things between each other. I better slow down and stop at this point. But any other final comments before we wrap up? Tell the audience how they can access your services,
Hmm.
why they should do so, of course, and also how they could follow and contact you.
So obviously, Twitter is a great place with me at Trev A Hall. Very active on that platform, or X, whatever you want to call it. Still Twitter to me. You can go the actual podcast website, miningstockdaily.com, where we publish the morning briefings and the week's commentary on that website. And then we also host a number of different podcasts within the Clear Commodity Network. Andrew, that's where you joined, I think it was Justin and I last year for an episode of Going Nuclear. So Justin Hune of Uranium Insider and I host that. We also have a battery metals podcast that Chris Berry does a remarkable job with called The Power Current. And then everybody's favorite macro navigator writer, Tony Greer, hosts our Oil Ground Up podcast as well. So we're growing a network of resource driven podcast content within Clear Commodity Network, and that continues to build. And there's more big news that we're working on in the background yet to come and to be announced there. So you can find that at clearcommodity.net.
That's great, Trevor. Appreciate that. I hope the audience follows up with some of these and gets them on their list as part of their due diligence work, and also to hear your voice on some of these programs as well. So, look, really appreciate the time. Looking forward to having you come back again soon. I thought it was a good chat, good to catch up, and hope
Yeah.
the audience enjoyed. And keep up the efforts on your side. Really appreciate it, Trevor.
Yeah, you too. Thanks, Andrew. Appreciate the invite. And it's always strange being on the other end of having to answer the questions and not be the one asking them. So I appreciate this.